The 1960 U-2 incident happened during the Cold War on 1 May 1960, during the presidency of Dwight D. Eisenhower and the premiership of Nikita Khrushchev, when a United States U-2 spy plane was shot down from Soviet airspace. The aircraft, flown by Central Intelligence Agency pilot Francis Gary Powers, was performing aerial reconnaissance when it was hit by an S-75D Vena surface-to-air missile and crashed in Sverdlovsk, and Powers was captured. Initially, the United States government tried to cover up the plane's purpose and mission, but was forced to admit its military nature when the Soviet government came forward with the U-2's intact remains and captured pilot, as well as photos of military bases in Russia taken by the aircraft, coming roughly 2 weeks before the scheduled opening of an East-West summit in Paris. The incident was a great embarrassment to the United States and prompted a marked deterioration in its relations with the Soviet Union. Powers was convicted of espionage and sentenced to 3 years of imprisonment plus 7 years of hard labor, but would be released 2 years later, on 10 February 1962, during a prisoner exchange for Soviet officer Rudolf Abel. Background: in July 1957, U.S. President Dwight D. Eisenhower requested permission from Pakistan's Prime Minister Hussein Suhrawardy for the U.S. to establish a secret intelligence facility in Pakistan and for the U-2 spy plane to fly from Pakistan. The U-2 flew at altitudes that could not be reached by Soviet fighter jets of the era. It was believed to be beyond the reach of Soviet missiles as well. A facility established in Badaba, 10 miles from Peshawar, was a cover for a major communications intercept operation run by the United States National Security Agency. Badaba was an excellent location because of its proximity to Soviet Central Asia. This enabled the monitoring of missile test sites, key infrastructure and communications. The U-2 spy in the sky was allowed to use the Pakistan Air Force portion of Peshawar Airport to gain vital photo intelligence in an era before satellite observation. President Eisenhower did not want to fly American U-2 pilots over the Soviet Union because he felt that if one of these pilots were to be shot down or captured, that it could be seen as an act of aggression. At a time like the Cold War, any act of aggression could spark the start of open conflict between the two countries. In order to ease the burden of flying Americans into Soviet airspace, the idea developed to have British pilots from the Royal Air Force fly these missions in place of the American Central Intelligence Agency pilots. Using British pilots allowed Eisenhower to be able to use the U-2 plane to see what the Soviet Union was hiding, while still being able to deny any affiliation if a mission became compromised. After the success of the first 2 British pilots, and because of pressure to determine the number of Soviet intercontinental ballistic missiles more accurately, Eisenhower allowed the flying of 2 more missions before the 4-Power Paris summit, scheduled for the 16th of May. The final 2 missions before the summit were to be flown by American pilots. On 9 April 1960, a U-2C spy plane of the Special CIA Unit 10-10, piloted by Bob Erickson, crossed the southern national boundary of the Soviet Union in the area of Pamir Mountains and flew over 4 Soviet top-secret military objects. The Semipalatinsk test site, the Dolin Air Base where Tu-95 strategic bombers were stationed, the surface-to-air missile test site of the Soviet Air Defense Forces near Saryshagin, and the Tyuratim missile range. The plane was detected by the Soviet Air Defense Forces when it had flown more than 250 kilometers over the Soviet national boundary and avoided several attempts at interception by a MiG-19 and a Su-9 during the flight. The U-2 left Soviet airspace and landed at an Iranian airstrip at Zaydan. It was clear that the U.S. Central Intelligence Agency had successfully performed an extraordinary intelligence operation. The next flight of the U-2 spy plane from Peshawar Airport was planned for late April. Event: on 28 April 1960, a U.S. Lockheed U-2C spy plane, Article 358, was ferried from Incirlik Air Base in Turkey to the U.S. base at Peshawar Airport by pilot Glenn Dunaway. Fuel for the aircraft had been ferried to Peshawar the previous day in a U.S. Air Force C-124 transport. A U.S. Air Force C-130 followed, carrying the ground crew, mission pilot Francis Gary Powers, and the backup pilot, Bob Erickson. On the morning of the 29th of April, the crew in Bad Abba was informed that the mission had been delayed one day. As a result, Bob Erickson flew Article 358 back to Incirlik, and John Chin ferried another U-2C, Article 360, from Incirlik to Peshawar. On the 30th of April, the mission was delayed one day further because of bad weather over the Soviet Union. The weather improved, and on the 1st of May, 15 days before the scheduled opening of the East-West Summit Conference in Paris, Captain Francis Gary Powers, flying Article 360, 56-6693 left the U.S. base in Peshawar on a mission with the operation's codeword Grand Slam to overfly the Soviet Union, photographing targets including the ICBM sites at the Baikonur Cosmodrome and Plesis Cosmodrome, then land at Bodo in Norway. At the time, the USSR had 6 ICBM launch pads, 2 at Baikonur and 4 at Plesisk. Mayak, then named Chelyabyinsk-65, an important industrial center of plutonium processing, was another of the targets that Powers was to photograph. A close study of Powers' account of the flight shows that one of the last targets he overflew, before being shot down, was the Chelyabyinsk-65 plutonium production facility. European region and extreme north were placed on red alert. Soon after the plane was detected, Lieutenant General of the Air Force Yevgeny Savitsky ordered the air unit commanders to attack the violator by all alert flights located in the area of foreign planes course, and to ram if necessary. Because of the U-2's extreme operating altitude, Soviet attempts to intercept the plane using fighter aircraft failed. The U-2's course was out of range of several of the nearest SAM sites, and one SAM site even failed to engage the aircraft since it was not on duty that day. The U-2 was eventually brought down near Kostyalino, Ural region, by the first of 3 SAR-2 guideline surface-to-air missiles fired by a battery commanded by Mikhail Voronov. The SAR-2 site had been previously identified by the CIA, using photos taken during Vice President Richard Nixon's visit to Sverdlovsk the previous summer. Powers was captured soon after parachuting safely down onto Russian soil. Powers carried with him a modified silver dollar which contained a lethal, shellfish-derived saxitoxin-tipped needle, but he did not use it. The SAM command center was unaware that the plane was destroyed for more than 30 minutes. One of the Soviet MiG-19 fighters pursuing Powers, piloted by Sergei Safronov, was also destroyed in the missile salvo. The MiG's IFF transponders were not yet switched to the new May codes because of the 1st of May holiday. American cover-up and exposure. 4 days after Powers disappeared, NASA issued a very detailed press release noting that an aircraft had gone missing north of Turkey. The press release speculated that the pilot might have fallen unconscious while the autopilot was still engaged, even falsely claiming that the pilot reported over the emergency frequency that he was experiencing oxygen difficulties. To bolster this, a U-2 plane was quickly painted in NASA colors and shown to the media, under the impression that the pilot had died and that the plane had been destroyed. The Americans decided to use the NASA cover-up plan. Nikita Khrushchev used the American misstep to embarrass President Eisenhower and his administration. That same day, on the 5th of May, the Senate made its first comments on the U-2 incident, and began a domestic political controversy for Eisenhower. Mike Mansfield, the Senate Majority Whip, stated, "First reports indicate that the president had no knowledge of the plane incident. If that is the case, we have got to ask whether or not this administration has any real control over the federal bureaucracy." Mansfield, more than any other person, highlighted the dilemma Eisenhower faced. Eisenhower could admit responsibility for the U-2 flight and likely ruin any chances for détente at the Paris summit, or he could continue to deny knowledge and indicate that he did not control his own administration. After Khrushchev found out about America's NASA cover story, he developed a political trap for Eisenhower. His plan began with the release of information to the world that a spy plane had been shot down in Soviet territory. But he did not reveal that the pilot of this plane had also been found and that he was alive. With the information that Khrushchev released, the Americans believed that they would be able to continue with their cover story that the crashed plane was a weather research aircraft and not a military spy plane. The cover-up said that the pilot of the U-2 weather plane had radioed in that he was experiencing oxygen difficulties while flying over Turkey. From there they claimed that the plane could have continued on its path because of autopilot, and that this could be the plane that crashed in the Soviet Union. The final attempt to make the cover story seem as real as possible was the grounding of all U-2 planes for mandatory inspection of oxygen systems in order to make sure that no other weather missions would have the same result as the one that was lost and possibly crashed in the Soviet Union. On May 7, Khrushchev sprang his trap and announced, "I must tell you a secret. When I made my first report I deliberately did not say that the pilot was alive and well. And now just look how many silly things the Americans have said." As the trap began to come together, it became clear that Gary Powers was alive and that he had told his mission to the Soviets. Also, because of the release of some photographs of the plane, there was evidence that most of the covered U-2 technologies had survived the crash. From this, Khrushchev was able to openly embarrass the Eisenhower administration by exposing the attempted cover-up. Yet despite Khrushchev's the 7th of May political trap, the Soviet premier still attempted to allow Eisenhower to save face, possibly to salvage the peace summit to some degree. Khrushchev specifically laid the blame for the U-2 not on Eisenhower himself, but on DCI Allen Dulles and the CIA. Khrushchev said that anyone wishing to understand the U-2's mission should seek a reply from Allen Dulles, at whose instructions the American aircraft flew over the Soviet Union. On the 9th of May, the Soviet premier told U.S. Ambassador Thompson that he could not help but suspect that someone had launched this operation with the deliberate intent of spoiling the summit meeting. Thompson also wrote in his diplomatic cable that Khrushchev suspected it was Allen Dulles, and that Khrushchev had heard about Senator Mansfield's remarks that Eisenhower did not control his own administration. Upon receiving this cable, Eisenhower, who frequently was very animated, was quiet and depressed. The only words he said to his secretary were, "I would like to resign." Meanwhile, the domestic pressure continued to mount. Eisenhower then accepted Dulles's argument that the congressional leadership needed to be briefed on the U-2 missions from the last 4 years. Dulles told the legislature that all U-2 flights were used for aerial espionage and had been flown pursuant to presidential directives. Still, Dulles played down Eisenhower's direct role in approving every previous U-2 flight. The next day, on the 10th of May, without consulting with any agency heads, House Appropriations Chair Clarence Cannon received considerable press attention when he, not President Eisenhower, revealed the true nature of the U-2 mission. He said to an open session of the House of Representatives that the U-2 was a CIA plane engaged in aerial espionage over the Soviet Union. Cannon said, "Mr. Chairman, on May 1, the Soviet government captured, 1,300 miles inside the boundaries of the Russian Empire, an American plane, operated by an American pilot, under the direction and control of the U.S. Central Intelligence Agency, and is now holding both the plane and the pilot. The plane was on an espionage mission. The activity was under the aegis of the Commander-in-Chief of the Armed Forces of the United States, for whom all members of the subcommittee have the highest regard and in whose military capacity they have the utmost confidence. At the end of Cannon's speech, Democrats and Republicans uncharacteristically rose to their feet to applaud. Still, Eisenhower faced criticism in the press for not controlling his own administration, as Cannon's speech only said the mission was under the aegis of the president, not directed by. Press reports were creating a belief in the public that Eisenhower had lost control, which Eisenhower would not let stand. Knowing that he was jeopardizing the Paris Peace Summit, Eisenhower decided to reveal the aerial espionage program and his direct role in it, an unprecedented move for a U.S. president. His speech on the 11th of May revolved around four main points: the need for intelligence gathering activities, the nature of intelligence gathering activities, how intelligence activities should be viewed, and, finally, that Americans should not be distracted from the real problems of the day. Eisenhower closed passionately by reacting to the Soviet claim that the U.S. acted provocatively and said they had better look at their own espionage record. As he finished, he told reporters he was still going to the Paris Peace Summit. Eisenhower's speech was exceptionally important because it revealed unequivocally to the world and U.S. public that the U.S. had engaged in covert espionage activities, and that those activities, specifically covert action, had been approved directly by the president. Today, a large part of the wreck as well as many items from Powers' survival pack are on display at the Central Armed Forces Museum in Moscow. A small piece of the plane was returned to the United States and is on display at the National Cryptologic Museum.